Well, here we are at the end, the last of the lectures, the last of the units on American comedians. Uh, Interestingly, stand-up comedians are very big right now, much bigger than they were when I was in college. Even though there were many big names and important names, there weren't the number of comedy clubs. It wasn't everywhere the way it is today. So the growth of the stand-up comedy has been meteoric, particularly in the 21st century. But here, as with everything else, we're going to go back and look at it from the early part of the 20th century, at least to get some idea. So I'm going to read you this because I think it's important. The essence of the art is creative distortion. Such distortion is achieved through exaggeration, stylization, incongruous context, and burlesque, treating that which is usually respected disrespectfully and vice versa. So the viewpoint of the comedian is always from the outside. They evoke pity and sympathy, as I say. They also evoke recognition in ourselves of what is being said, of the truth of what is being said. The funny part, the part that makes us laugh, is the incongruity of things. And sometimes that incongruity is something that we're not aware of until the comedian points it out. So that, in a way, that's what we're going to look at here. There are historical roots to stand-up comedy and to comedians in general. As with so many parts of American entertainment, minstrel shows are key to everything that happened. Even when we eventually take away the blackface, we stop looking at the blackface and the characterization of Black Americans, which was deeply racist. We still see that there's a basis for comedy and a basis for performance and entertainment there that's still with us today. They had jokes and riddles. There were monologues and there were sketches, just like there are today. You undoubtedly know a riddle that dates back to minstrel show times. Why did the chicken cross the road? That dates from minstrel shows, so it's very old. The other strain that feeds into it, or one other strain that feeds into it, were clowns. Clowns in the 19th century were much more like stand-up comics. They would perform monologues, sing songs, recite poems, and so on. They weren't the kind of knockabout clowns as we think of them today quite so much. That's the circus clowns. The greatest of those was in the 19th century was Dan Rice. He actually considered a run for the presidency. He was so well known, and visually, as you can see down here on the left, he may have been one of the models for Uncle Sam. And then there were humorists, humorous writers. Now, Mark Twain being the leading one of those in the 19th century and into the early 20th century. Twain made a good deal of his living on the lecture circuit, doing readings of his work and telling stories. And he actually tested out comic deliveries, timing, and repetition in order to find out what was funny and what worked. So he worked very much the way a stand-up comic did. Those three things eventually led us to vaudeville. And coming up through vaudeville, vaudeville was variety shows. And that starts again in the 19th century and comes into the 20th century. If, for instance, you have an old theater in your town, it's possible that was originally a vaudeville house. They'd had stages and they had room for a screen so they could show movies too. But the main thing was the variety, and comedy was generally king in vaudeville. Comedy was king. People would do short acts with a lot of different acts in there, and the top comedian was called the top banana, and would command the most money. They the vaudeville comedians fed eventually into radio and then into television. Many of the vaudeville comedians of the early 20th century ended up working that way. So, and they did various different ways, had various different ways of playing the comedy. There were the jokes, and there was sketch comedy. There was a drunk act or a stump speech. A stump speech would be like a monologue. They eventually did long format and insult comedy and trickster comedy. So they're all different kinds of comedy, and they're probably kinds that I have left out. And I've listed some of the names here who made themselves known through television and radio and so on. So I say there are different kind of routes. There were those who started in vaudeville and then went to radio and then went to television from there. There was those who started in stand-up and then went to Hollywood and then went to radio and then went to television. Everybody eventually ended up in television when television started to come into its own around 1950. So the radio comedians, some of these names of radio comedians were huge. I mean, we already know Amos and Andy. The first show heard coast to coast, but we don't have anymore kind of the cultural memory of Fred Allen, who back in the 30s was a huge name in comedy. Fanny Brice, enormous name. We mentioned her earlier. Jack Benny, I'll talk about in a moment a little bit. The television comedians, also very, very big. Sid Caesar, his show, Your Show of Shows, also starred Imogene Coca and Carl Reiner. And he's still considered by many comedians to be Sid Caesar to be the funniest man to ever appear on television. And these other names, you notice that Jack Benny appears on radio, Jack Benny appears on television. Lucille Ball started in radio and went to television. Milton Berle was kind of a product of television. Uncle Milton, Mr. What was he? Mr. Saturday Night something. He was something like that. The film comedians, the silent ones like Chaplin and Keaton, they had their day, but when talkies came in, particularly for Keaton, their careers were over. Keaton's voice was kind of gravelly and not funny. Bob Hope became very, very big. Jerry Lewis, very, very big. And then there were others, many others. We don't have film comedians in the same way that we used to. And I have to admit something to you all here, is that I had to change this lecture this year because of Will Rogers. Actually, because of my wife, because of Will Rogers. My wife gave me a terrific book on Native American comedians. And I learned a huge amount from it. But kind of the most surprising thing to me was that Will Rogers was Cherokee. I knew about Will Rogers growing up. He's before my time, but he was known as the cowboy comedian even then, kind of a folksy, down-home style, very, very influential. So his family identified as Cherokee. They came through the Civil War on the other side. They owned slaves. They owned people. But somehow Will kind of separated himself off and went into entertainment, and he started doing rope tricks and working in Wild West shows and then went to vaudeville doing the rope tricks because he was really quite good at them, and eventually into movies. He became really, really big in vaudeville. He was so big that he ended up writing a weekly newspaper column. And the most important thing about him is that he championed working people. He was for the little guy. He was against big business. He was against the government. And he talked to people in such a way that they really felt like he understood them. He was endlessly quotable, endlessly quotable. And he worked very hard at it. Now you're going to read, I've included a chapter from this book that my wife gave me for you to read. So you're gonna read about an unfortunate incident with him, and I'm not going to talk about that now. I'm going to let you read it. But I will say that toward the end of his life, and he died quite tragically in a plane crash. He was becoming more and more outspoken about the terrible way that Native Americans were treated in this country, and about the lies and the breaking of treaties that went on, and the poverty that they were kept in. So while he was for the little guy everywhere, his bitterness about his own people was starting to come out. Jack Benny was also, I think, following. He was concurrent in some respects, but I think a little younger than Will Rogers, and he certainly came after. He became very big in vaudeville also, and moved to radio, and then eventually television. And his humor was not particularly scathing or cutting. It was self-deprecating, meaning that he was often the butt of his own jokes. His persona, the comic persona he created, was miserly, though by all accounts he was quite a generous man. But he eked a lot of humor out of the fact that he was supposedly a miser. Mostly in his humor, his comedy, his timing is unparalleled. He just knows how to hold an audience in the palm of his hand and hit the punchline when he wants and get the laugh. And it's quite beautiful to see. Not all the comedians who came up in the 20th century are male, though most are. There were female comedians, Fanny Brice, as we know, Sherry Lewis, who was a ventriloquist and did a kids act with a puppet called Lamb Chop, and Lamb Chop is still a character that's around. Though Sherry Lewis also supposedly did an adult show, but I've never been able to find any recordings of that. Joan Rivers, Phyllis Diller, and Moms Mabley. Moms Mabley was an unusual in that she was an older woman, and she was a woman of color working in comedy, and got a lot of television time. There were other BIPOC comedians, Burt Williams, as you know, Bill Russell, Bill Cosby, I'm sure you know, but others before him, Nipsey Russell, Red Fox, Freddie Prinze, I'm going to mention, Cheech and Chong, you may have heard of, and of course, as I said, Moms Mabley, and again, others. The big change in comedy from the old style, which was kind of stand-up, safe, set jokes, to a new kind of social focus, came with a group of comedians that were labeled, not by themselves, but by a critic, as the sick comedians. Dick Gregory, Mort Sahl, Mike Nichols and Elaine May, they were a team. Jonathan Winters, Lenny Bruce. Their comedy was often improvisational. The humor was very topical. It was often social, though not always. Mort Sahl and Dick Gregory were very political in their humor. Jonathan Winters and Nichols and May were very social in their humor, critiquing society, poking fun at society. If you don't know Jonathan Winters, by the way, he was an improviser, and for those of you who remember Robin Williams, who died not too long ago, he was Robin Williams' inspiration. And I know they performed together at least on one occasion. Lenny Bruce, though, was the big name in the sick comedians. He just crossed taboo lines in what he talked about. It was at a time when you couldn't talk about sex on stage, not in any open way. It was a time when you couldn't talk about race and religion and society, and all of these things that are such an integral, unfortunately, integral part of the darker side of our culture. He skewered. He was arrested numerous times for profanity, and he was tried. And he was constantly persecuted because of his honesty. His comedy doesn't play now. I used to have students listen to clips of him, and it doesn't play anymore. You can recognize the humor in it, but you don't laugh at it. It was laughed at because it was so immediate and so of the moment that people were shocked and delighted that somebody would say the things that he was saying. He was very influenced by jazz, and as I say, he was a societal critic, but he was the first stand-up comic in mainstream who used profanity on stage, and he was arrested for using profanity. If you can imagine that at this time, that the words were so taboo that you could be arrested for it. George Carlin kind of followed Lenny Bruce, and George Carlin would have said, for those of you who know, and I'm sure that there's at least a couple of you in the class who still listen to George Carlin or watch him. Carlin would have told you that he was influenced by Lenny Bruce, but his focus on language was different. He focused on drugs and hypocrisy and sex and all these things, but he was very language oriented. And if Lenny Bruce is influenced by jazz, then George Carlin is more influenced by rock and roll. His comedy eventually, I mean, early on he was pretty much a straight comic, but as the 60s hit, he started to change, and his comedy became more like a lecture. So in that sense, he owes a debt to the stump speeches of the minstrel shows, but he was out to skewer the hypocrisy of those in control. And to his death, he never stopped doing that. Freddie Prinze. Freddie Prinze is the first Puerto Rican comic of note in this country. As you can see here, he had a very short life. Professional career was 6 years, and it sparkled, and that comedy set that he did, it was amazing. And unfortunately, his own inner demons or whatever just kind of ate him up. But to see his original act is quite something, and you can see that on YouTube. And then eventually he got a sitcom, Chico and the Man, and that was 2 years, and then he was gone. But he paved the way for other Latinx comedians. There's no question about that, and other comedians of color. And then we come to Richard Pryor. Pryor, Pryor's comedy was deeply, deeply personal, about being Black, about his drug problems and his sexual experiences, about his life. And he laid it out there for everyone to see. If you know him only from seeing him in film, then hopefully you're in for a treat to see him in clips. He was, it's hard to just, the best thing to do, because you can read this. I just want to go to this last page and just read you this. From introduction, The Fear of Black Laughter. Furious, cool, Richard Pryor and the world that made him. Richard found all the materials he could ever need among the hair clippings, blood clumps, sawdust, and cigarette butts he swept up from the barbershop, meat-packing plants, and pool halls, blowing in the wind, as it were, in his native Peoria. He gathered it all together and deliberately, playfully rearranged and assembled that cast-off detritus into something unexpected, beautiful, frightening, and new. The greatest tragedy of Richard Pryor may have been that he was content to be labeled a comic. He was beyond mere comedy. If you read transcripts of his breakthrough routines, you'll find nothing remotely funny in the words themselves as printed on the page. It was all in his delivery, his empathy, his willingness to give himself fully to the characters he portrayed and to let them take possession of him, so much so that it seemed blasphemous to speak of other comedians when discussing Richard Pryor. There are no others. No one else could do on stage what Richard Pryor did. As his friend David Brenner says, he stands alone. Okay, that's it. On to the last discussion.